So today we are continuing our discussion about immortality by scientific means, or afterlife in science. Today we are going to talk about cryonics and near-death experiences. First, we will be talking about cryonics. Cryonics means icy cold in Greek language. And cryonics is low temperature conservation of people and animals who cannot be supported by modern medicine, with the hope of possible healing and resuscitation in the future. Robert Ettinger is credited to have originated cryonics by the publication of his 1962 book, The Prospect of Immortality. Now, the book was republished back in 2005, never went out of print, very popular work. And in this book, Robert Ettinger, and it seems that he was the first one, advanced some arguments that freezing, which is apparently fatal today, may be reversible in the future. So he applied the same argumentation to the process of dying itself, saying that the early stages of clinical death may be reversible. They may be reversible in the future. And combining those two ideas, he suggested that freezing people right after they die may help those people be resuscitated and have a second chance in life. In other words, that cryonics may save lives. So Ettinger came to be credited as the founder of the movement. In 1962, another author, Ivan Cooper, privately published his own book, which was called Immortality, Physically, Scientifically, Now. That was a book in which he independently arrived at the same conclusions as Ettinger. And in 1964, Ivan Cooper founded the first Life Extension Society. That was the first cryonic organization to promote the so-called freezing program. It is believed that the first person who went through the freezing procedure, or as they call it, suspended animation, was Dr. James Bedford. In 1967, he was 73-year-old psychology professor, and after he died, he was placed in cryopreservation, or the state of suspended animation. He still remains frozen today at Alcor Life Extension Foundation, a non-for-profit organization that was founded in California in 1972. There are two forms of cryopreservation, the so-called whole body preservation and neuropreservation, which is the cryopreservation of the brain. Basically, it means that if a person chooses to be neuropreserved, the standby team of people will sever his or her head from the body and will preserve only the head with the brain, which is, of course, even creepier than preserving the whole body. Just before this lecture, I checked out on the internet how much would it cost now for a person to be cryopreserved. So, are you ready? The whole body cryopreservation will cost you $150,000. If you choose, or if you take an option of preserving only your head, that will cost you only $90,000. Plus, of course, maybe yearly membership before this procedure is done, so before you die, and probably some expenses after that should be paid by your relatives. The problem, of course, is whether anyone would like in the future to resuscitate you. But that is out of your control. Now, with current medical technology, cryopreservation of people is not reversible. So when someone does this, this person is hoping for resuscitation in the future. However, this is simply a hope that is not supported scientifically. Now, or at this point, only cells, tissues, and small organs can be cryopreserved reversibly, which is a very good thing because many illnesses need an immediate intervention, and sometimes a person finds himself or herself in such a situation that he's far away from a hospital that can do what should be done. For example, if you are in a combat zone in Afghanistan, then the technique of cryopreservation actually is working already. Some cells, some tissues, some of your organs may be frozen, and that will give you time to be transported into a hospital, and then they could be unfrozen, and the surgery or any other procedure could be done to save lives, and that what's already been done. Now let's talk about some philosophical premises of cryonics, some basic premises that are not yet supported by science. The first premise is that long-term memory, personality, and identity are stored in durable cell structures and patterns within the brain that do not require continuous brain activity to survive. So the first part of this premise is most probably true, because we all know that when we lose consciousness for a while, or when we are in a medically induced coma, our brain is still working, but still we have no consciousness, self-consciousness, and when we come back, our long-term memory, our personality, our identity will be retained. So we assume that the same will happen if our brain is simply frozen. However, the second part of this assumption has not been proven, that those memories, personality, identity, etc., do not require continuous brain activity to survive. That is subject for future proofs. The second assumption is that brain structures encoding personality and long-term memory persist for some time after legal death. This is crucial because we do not really know what death is if we are talking about death that is irreversible. In 19th century, let's say if you have a cardiac arrest, you will die. Nowadays, that event may be reversible, and you may live happily ever after when you are resuscitated. So we do not really know whether our brain structures persist for some time, and we do not know for what time, if they do, after legal death. That's why if someone decides to go through this cryopreservation procedure, this person should also pay for the so-called standby team, a team of medical professionals who are ready to freeze your body or simply freeze your head, not wasting any minutes or even seconds after you die. The sooner the better. But we do not really know whether that is enough or not. The third premise of cryonics is even more questionable. The third premise of cryonics is that those structures, encoding personality and long-term memory, are conserved by cryopreservation. Now, we do not know that simply because we have no medical procedure that will unfreeze a human being successfully so that this human being will be resuscitated. Today, if we unfreeze this cryopreserved bodies, we will damage the brain cell structures. So therefore, we do not know whether it will be ever possible to resuscitate people who are cryopreserved, or as they say, who are in a state of suspended animation. And finally, the fourth premise of cryonics is that future technology will be able to do it, will be able to restore encoded memories to functional capacity in the future. This is, again, a hypothesis. It is a hypothesis that will be either proven or disproven by science, and I think in the near future, because there have been some experiments and successful experiments that were done with animals. So nowadays, these techniques are being developed, but on the animal stage, so to say. So far, nothing has been done with humans in this respect. Now, what do we know? So what is the science behind cryonics? We do know that some of the experiments with dogs and pigs have already been successful. So here are just two of them. In 2005, scientists at the University of Pittsburgh managed to place dogs in suspended animation, and after 3 hours of clinical death, 3 hours is quite enough, they brought them back to life without brain damage. So that is possible. Of course, we cannot compare dogs' brains with human brains, but it all depends basically on the advances of modern science. In 2006, the medical doctors from the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston proposed a technique of replacing blood with saline solution and tested it on pigs. The method was used 200 times with a 90% success rate, which is pretty good. So it can be done with animals, and I assume that experiments are still going on, and there will come some time when we try this on humans. Now, the strategy of cryopreserving one's human body in order for this body to be resuscitated may be a good scientific strategy, but it may come into conflicts with religion. So some of the religions are neutral when it comes to those kind of scientific investigations. Some of the adherents of Christianity may be against cryopreservation on the premise that every person who dies should be buried according to the Christian rituals. And that is essential for the resurrection. But other Christians could be, in fact, applauding those strategies, and some of the Christians are, in fact, encouraging those kind of investigations because they conflate the idea of resuscitation of the body as a result of freezing and then unfreezing the body. They conflate this idea with the bodily resurrection of the dead, and that does look like the bodily resurrection. You simply die, and in 500 years you are resuscitated. You have back your own body, you have back your own identity and personality. And some Christians interpret this as another proof of the Christian idea of bodily resurrection. Now let's talk about near-death experiences. Near-death experiences is another area in which modern medicine is advancing, and advancing very quickly. The scientific study of near-death experiences started in 1975 with the publication of the famous book by Raymond Moody, Life After Death. Raymond Moody was a medical doctor who got interested in those unusual experiences. He was asking his patients about those experiences, and after asking many patients, he realized that there are some common elements in those experiences. He collected all those stories, he classified those near-death experiences, and he was the first one to publish the first scientific book about that area of medical research. The book was called Life After Death. It was, and I think still is, a very popular book about near-death experiences. I remember when I was in the Soviet Union in 1970s, I've read this book in Russian translation because this book was translated into Russian and distributed through the Russian black market. We did not have the possibility to buy those books in bookstores because of the Soviet censorship. But the books were still being translated and published in the so-called self-publishing mode, and they were sold, as I said, on the black market. I remember how fascinated I was when reading this book in 1970s or early 1980s. So in his book, Raymond Moody classifies those near-death experiences and distinguishes the common elements in them. And as far as I know, the subsequent studies of near-death experiences do not contradict Raymond Moody's conclusions. So let us discuss those common elements of near-death experiences with some details. First, when the person is going through these near-death experiences, and in many cases, this is the person who is already in the hospital, who is either severely ill or is going through the surgery, and it is during the surgery that the person, in many cases, goes through this kind of experience. This person finds himself or herself in a situation in which it is very difficult to express what this person is experiencing in ordinary language. Why? Because many people are saying that the world or the afterworld they find themselves in is the world that is devoid of space and time. And we, in this world, find ourselves in the space and time continuum, and our sense perception is organized in such a way as to give us the expression of this space-time continuum. And it is very difficult to express what you experience in a world, let's say, that does not have time. Then the person who is going through the near-death experiences is usually hearing the doctors pronounce them dead. Of course, this is in the case when this person was in the hospital or going through the surgery or just had some horrible health event like cardiac arrest and was brought to a hospital, to the emergency room. So the person hears the doctor pronounced them dead. And also, this person may have out-of-body experience. I have to say that out-of-body experience is usually a part of near-death experience, but out-of-body experience can also be happening to a person without near-death experience itself. I know that some people told me they had out-of-body experience when they were looking at their own bodies from above. And that may happen, from what I gather, if a person goes through an extremely serious stress or is extremely ill. Those kind of experiences may sometimes happen. So it is also a common element of a near-death experience when you can look at your own body from a different perspective. When you see your body, laying down, and medical doctors are trying to revive you, but then they realize that you are clinically dead. They pronounce you dead. And then you hear some unusual noises. So that is another common element in near-death experience, unusual auditory sensations. Those sensations can be different, sometimes noises, sometimes melodies, sometimes something else. And then you are entering the so-called dark tunnel. Now, the dark tunnel is often described as a bridge between our material world and the next world to come, however we call it, the spiritual world, the afterlife world. The dark tunnel is that bridge that separates those two worlds. And in one of the near-death experience, I've read that the dark tunnel was also the place for those souls, or for those people, for those beings who were not able to actually cross this bridge and find themselves on the other side. So the dark tunnel in this case may serve as an image of hell. It is completely dark and people cannot find their way. But if you can find your way, and if you go through this tunnel, then you have a series of other near-death experiences. First, usually you meeting some other beings. In some cases, people who go through these experiences are saying that they meet their relatives. That is probably the most common thing. You meet your dead relatives, uncles, parents, sisters, grandparents. Sometimes you meet people whom you did not know, but later on, when you come back, you will discover that these were your relatives. Sometimes you didn't know about them, or sometimes they were great-grandparents, and you simply never met them in life. At other time, these are spiritual beings. So some kind of beings who are trying to help you, whom you do not know. Then you usually encounter a being of light. This is a very interesting element of near-death experience, because this being of light may remind us of some of our readings. For example, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. According to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, a person who is dying first encounters a beam of light. And in the context of Tibetan Buddhism, that beam of light is associated with Buddha's nature. So near-death experiences do not discriminate. Sometimes people with deep religious beliefs go through them. At other times, atheists go through them, agnostics, people of various religions. So it doesn't really matter whether you are a believer or not, to have near-death experiences. But what matters is your interpretation that is based on your personal beliefs. So people who held Christian beliefs interpreted this being of light to be Jesus. And other people who may have been atheists may have been interpreting this being of light as simply a being of light. But in most cases, this being of light is caring. You feel love, and even more than just human love, a very intense force of love that comes from this being of light. You feel comforted, you feel very safe. So no matter whether you are a believer or not, the feelings that people experience when encountering this being of light are usually good, comforting, positive. It is very rare that people have near-death experiences and encounter some demonic beings. And by the way, that is very different from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. According to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, people who die go through several bardos, and in the second bardo, they meet good deities and evil deities. So the negative experience, according to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, is necessary. It is not so according to our modern near-death experiences. So after encountering this being of light, a person usually goes through a panoramic review of his or her life. Now, this review is happening very quickly. Again, there is no feeling of time, there is no feeling of space, and therefore the review is very fast, but as people say, they are able to understand what is going on, and many of them actually have the ability to communicate with the relative, the spiritual beings, with the being of light, by simply thinking some thoughts. So the communication is telepathic. And the being of light usually says something with respect to how much can you show me for your life, or as one person says it, was it worth it? So you have a panoramic review of your life, and as I remember from one near-death experience, the idea behind the panoramic review is to see the moments in which you acted most spiritually. In other words, it does not really depend on your religious affiliation. It does not depend on your social status or your economic and financial wealth, etc. So all those social markers are absent, and what is of interest is your spiritual behavior, and spiritual behavior is selfless behavior. In other words, when you review your life, you see when you acted selflessly, when you helped people simply because you wanted to help them, when you did actions like that. And that seems to be the most important part of your life. After the panoramic review of life, the person who is going through this kind of experience is approaching the so-called border of limit. Now, the border of limit is a common element of near-death experiences that is very important philosophically, I think. Because this border of limit suggests some kind of a border which separates this life from the afterlife, and if you cross the border, your death will be irreversible. So it all comes down to our philosophical question, what is death? Because today, let's say if you have, God forbid, a cardiac arrest, that does not mean that this death, clinical death, is irreversible. You can be resuscitated. The same can be said about many other illnesses. What was irreversible death in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries is not necessarily irreversible now. So the question is there any kind of death that is completely irreversible? According to near-death experiences, yes, there is, and it is related with this border of limit, this mysterious border. If you cross the border, you cannot come back. And since all people who had those near-death experiences came back, none of them usually is able to actually cross the border. It's very interesting that many people, maybe most of the people who go through near-death experiences do not want to come back. They feel so good in this afterlife realm. They feel so comforted that when they look back at their wretched bodies, and when they look back at their lives that are full of suffering and misery, they do not want to come back. However, in most of the cases, they are not allowed to cross the border. Sometimes they are told that they have to come back. Sometimes they are told that this is not their time. And if they persist, they are forced into their bodies. So the next common element of near-death experience is the coming back, when they, again, in many cases, are forced back into their bodies, and already they wake up remembering this experience. After that, if they decide to tell the story, they tell their story to others. And we know that near-death experiences are not, in fact, limited to our time. There are some accounts of similar experiences that come to us even from the Middle Ages. So it seems that back in those days, when science was not as developed, some of the people were able to go through some unusual experiences and near-death experiences that they would later write down for posterity, interpreting them in terms of divine visions. Nowadays, of course, with the advances of modern medicine, we have thousands of stories like that. People are telling their stories for various reasons, but the most important reason is that these near-death experiences have profound effects on their lives. And this is another common element of NDEs. People who went through NDEs are usually significantly changed. They change their lifestyle, they change their belief system. In many cases, they choose a different profession. So those experiences seem to have some practical implications for the rest of their lives. And I think that concludes our discussion of the common elements of the near-death experiences. Let me add that there are some possible explanations for those near-death experiences. Of course, the first hypothesis is that life exists after death, and those people did really experience something real that awaits us after we die. The second possible explanation is that after we die, our brain is still working over time, for some time, and therefore produces those kind of experiences. Another hypothesis is saying that we have a chemical in our brain that can produce those kind of experiences. And when people are about to die, when they are at the crossing between life and death, what the brain does, it is releasing gigantic doses of this chemical, and it is this chemical that actually makes us basically dream or have those visions that we take to be real. Now, there is no final solution to the problem of near-death experiences. Science cannot tell us for sure what are the reasons for those experiences. Hopefully, in 50 years, 100 years, when medical science advances enough and would be able to understand how our brain works in its full complexity, we will be able to know more about NDEs. But still, at this point, NDEs are the first scientific indication of the possibility of life after death that we have. And that is already, I think, very exciting. And that concludes today's lecture. Thank you for watching. See you next time.